In August of 1991, the Soviet Union was on its last legs and a coup was launched by the State Committee on the State of Emergency, what a funny name there, the KGB, Communist Party hardliners, and elements of the military as Gorbachev was placed under house arrest, and the committee claimed that Gorbachev was sick, but everyone knew what was actually going on. Gorbachev would be an outspoken critic against the coup government during its brief reign as he refused to resign to the plotters. Also, the military was rather split on which side to support. Some supported the coup while others supported Yeltsin and the anti-coup faction, which would eventually rise to power. Additionally, many normal Soviet people protested and aided Yeltsin and the anti-coup forces. Although occasional fighting broke out and things were extremely tense, the coup would fail and the USSR would implode. A lot of other details are very difficult to accurately get, as Soviet historical archives are closed and were only open in the 90s, so lots of details are possibly distorted to promote a certain narrative, so the basic summary here will be what I'm going with for context. But what if in an alternate timeline the August coup was successful and the Soviet Union remained, at least temporarily? Conditions to make the coup successful would be if Gorbachev resigned, if the military had been in favor of the coup instead of being split, and of course, the people had more power than the Soviet government as they had grown to like Gorbachev's reforms and capitalism's entry into the Union, so they weren't blindly listening to the coup government's ideas. So the government would have to have more control over the people if they really wanted to succeed with the coup. How would these conditions be accomplished? Well, that's actually very difficult again, as lots of Soviet history, particularly about the August coup, is not available to historians. Some information that was researched in the 90s pointed to Gorbachev approving the coup so that he could come out and stop it and then end up looking very good and seemed like everything is under control. So you kind of see my issues when trying to create an accurate alternate history scenario here, you know? This brings me to Minister of Defense Dmitry Yazov. No, Yazov wouldn't clear the skies for a great trial to fire the USSR's nukes at Germany or the West. This isn't a Hearts of Iron 4 game. Dmitry Yazov had served in World War II, taking part in quite a few battles on the Eastern Front from 1941 to 1945, and he was in charge of Soviet ground forces in Cuba during the missile crisis, where he was ordered to attack Guantanamo Bay with a nuclear cruise missile if war broke out. Yazov would also become the Soviet Minister of Defense in 1987, after making a pretty good impression on Gorbachev in 1986. From there on, he oversaw the end of the Soviet-Afghan War and violent crackdowns in Azerbaijan and Lithuania. During the coup, Yazov was a member of the State Emergency Committee and ordered General Pavel Grachev, commander of Soviet airborne forces, to begin coordinating with the KGB to implement martial law. However, at this time, Grachev was considered to be a competent military figure for his service in the Soviet-Afghan War and sided with Yeltsin as well as the anti-coup crowd. As a side note, Grachev would then take Yazov's place as Minister of Defense and be dismissed for military incompetence during the First Chechen War, where he reportedly ordered a disastrous storming of Grozny while drunk at his birthday celebration, but that's a story for another time. Additionally, although the coup hardliners had cut off communications with the nuclear duty officers and Soviet Air Force Commander-in-Chief Yevgeny Shaposhnikov opposed the coup and claimed in his memoirs that he and commanders of the Soviet Navy and strategic rocket forces had told Yazov that they would not follow his orders for a nuclear launch. Also, after the coup, Gorbachev refused to admit that he had lost control over the country's nuclear weapons and that decisions were in the hands of individual military leaders in the Air Force and Navy to not support Yazov. Again, you can see issues with the historical records being closed. It's difficult to know the extent to which this was true. But furthermore, the KGB's elite Alpha and Vimpel groups did not move on the White House as planned, and Yazov ordered the troops to pull out of Moscow afterwards. Without airborne troops, the Air Force, Navy, nukes, or the Russian White House, the coup was absolutely doomed to failure, and Yazov would make an apology video to Gorbachev, and things would be fine as Yazov was released in 1993. Understand all of the context and how difficult it is to get more info? Great. Now it's time for me to get into the alternate history part of this video, based on this very limited information. In this alternate timeline, there has to be a Soviet Airborne Forces commander who sides with the coup, and just one element of the nuclear weapons command structure of the Soviet Union that has to be allied with Yazov in order to provide more credibility to good old Dmitry Yazov's coup. Regarding the White House, if Alpha and Vimpel groups also seize the White House, that would heavily increase tensions among both factions, as if military forces standing off against one another, nukes, and now involving taking the White House is making everything even more tense and also more symbolic. But the icing on the cake will be, assuming that part about Gorbachev approving the coup to gain more control, the hardliners would have to bring that out to light to completely discredit Gorbachev. So now that the coup has been successfully accomplished, what's going to happen with the USSR? Now, I feel like Yazov would become the next general secretary of the Soviet Union, as Gennady Yanayev was very bad at trying to get public support and to get journalists to believe anything that he said. Also, Yanayev's hands were shaking so much that the journalists believed that he was drunk during his interviews in the coup. So Yazov will politely tell him to step down because he's the only one who had made this whole coup happen, and again, this still isn't going to be a Hearts of Iron 4 game. Domestically, the USSR in the early 90s had absolutely nothing going for it. The Union was in a severe economic and political crisis. There was scarcity of food, medicine, and other consumables being widespread. People had to stand in very long lines to even buy essential goods. Fuel stocks were as much as 50% lower than they had been estimated to be needed for the approaching winter, and of course, inflation exceeded 300% per year, with factories lacking the cash they needed to pay anyone's salaries. Kids, I'm telling you, communism sucks. In this alternate timeline, the domestic issues of the 90s are only further exacerbated by martial law being enacted and other communist hardliners being against all of Gorbachev's reforms, which relieved some of the major issues, yet the hardliners believed that Gorbachev's popular reforms were what destroyed the Soviet Union. They would definitely do everything in their power to try to return things to the bland Brezhnev era, while Yazov is having lots of ideas about the Khrushchev and Lenin eras. Also, there would be many purges of anti-coup government officials. So, when the Soviet hardliners try to get rid of things like McDonald's, people will riot. And personally, being a hardcore McDonald's enjoyer, before they started making all of their meat patties smaller, the Soviet people would only end their protests and riots if the hardliners okayed McDonald's or fired shots into the crowd. Either way, the government is losing. Another issue in the early 90s for the Soviet Union is breakaway regions. The Baltic states, as well as regions in the Caucasus, really didn't like being part of the USSR and would break away. Yazov would definitely send in troops into these regions, as before the coup he suppressed Lithuanians and did some things in Azerbaijan that would definitely get this video age restricted. How would these desperate interventions go? Well, the military was already overstretched with martial law and poor morale, so I don't think things in these regions would go over very well. But one thing for sure is that the Soviet Union is keeping Belarus and Ukraine, at least for now. During Soviet attempts to retain control over these breakaway areas, it's likely that the US and NATO would cut off aid and cooperation with the Soviet Union as a result of the coup. Since the only Soviet-supported dictators, communist bloc countries, and for some reason Canada expressed the ability in, or at least potentially allying, to work with the coup government, I think it's safe to say that Yazov would immediately be met with a rough geopolitical scene, especially with the breakaway states within the USSR. The fall of the Soviet Union would definitely come, possibly in 1993, as Yazov cannot maintain martial law forever and the hardliner politicians are very stupid and of course extremely unpopular. But you see, there's very little the international community could do to the Soviet Union, as Yazov has nukes and nobody's touching that, at least overtly. This time, from 1991 to 1993, would be a reactionary period and one of broken dreams where people had hoped for freedom and democracy but ended up with more authoritarianism. But things would change once the Union falls. Alternate Russia in the 1990s would likely be pretty similar to how it was in our own timeline, with chaos, mafia, oligarchs. Depending on who won the US presidential election of 1992, maybe things are even better or even worse, which I'm unsure of how much the coup would impact US politics. People are immediately very happy that the Soviet Union is gone, but over the next few years grow nostalgic due to how terrible Yeltsin is. However, in this alternate timeline, there was a period of reactionary communism which didn't sit well with people, so how that impacts Russian politics is beyond my ability to accurately predict. Also, Yazov's fate is pretty uncertain. But all of that was just one possible scenario for if the August 1991 coup was successful in temporarily preserving the Soviet Union. What do you think would have happened? Let me know in the comments below, and thank you for watching.